Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here on this cold Friday afternoon. It's a great pleasure to introduce Sharmila Rudrappa as our speaker today for the Center for South Asian Studies lecture series. Professor Rudrappa is the director of the Center for Asian American Studies and a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Texas, Austin. Her research and her teaching focuses on biomarkets, labor and reproductive justice, and connects the fields of South Asian and South Asian American studies. Her first book, Ethnic Roots to Becoming American, Indian Immigrants and the Cultures of Citizenship, is an ethnography of a shelter for battered South Asian American women and a cultural organization in Chicago. The book contextualizes immigrant race politics within the larger cultural turn we see in the sphere of American politics in the late 20th century. Her second book, Discounted Life, The Price of Global Surrogacy in India, was published by NYU Press this past December and addresses the rise of surrogacy in India as a multi-million-dollar global industry. Her talk today will in part draw from some of the research that this book covers, as well as point to and point towards upcoming research that she's working on. So, thank you.
It's green. Okay. First of all, I thank the Center for South Asian Studies for inviting me to do this talk. And it's always good to be away from Austin, especially when students are going to be allowed to carry guns on campus. We have campus carry, and we're not allowed to ask which students have guns and which ones don't. So I'm presuming none of you have guns here, but that might be wrong. Not as yet. Thank you all for being here as well on a Friday afternoon to listen to my talk. What I'm going to be doing in this talk today is draw a little bit, quite a bit from my book, but also think about new directions I want to take my work. So in that sense, it might feel a little bit open-ended at the end, or maybe too pessimistic, and I would love feedback because this is a project that I want to do further down. Anyway, so I'm basically also going to be reading from my talk, and I might jump in every now and then to go to my overheads. And I'm hoping to talk for about 35 minutes, because I know every minute over that, I start losing audience goodwill. So with that in mind, let me begin. Having just finished my book on transnational surrogacy, I believed I'd continue to write about reproductive markets, something I'd been working on since 2008. But my plans were waylaid in June 2015 in Bangalore. Umesha, who actually works for my father as a driver and had helped me do a lot of my field work in terms of driving me around in Bangalore, he'd said, Umesha, who's 30 years old, and whose family lives among the sugarcane fields of Mandya in Karnataka, which is the district right next to Bangalore. Umesha tells me, he says, there are no more earthworms in our fields, Akka. And I was like, earthworms, why are you telling me this? And I had this look on my face, and he says, we've burnt them out with fertilizers. We've burnt them out with fertilizers, right? And so India is the world's second largest producer of sugar after Brazil. The southern Indian state of Karnataka is the third largest sugarcane grower in India, and the sugarcane fields of the lush green district of Mandya are the most productive in the state. It's an incredibly rich district. Let's go to the next slide, right? And this is a region I'm incredibly familiar with because my family comes actually from Coorg, and having grown up in Bangalore, this is a route that we took every single time going up to the mountains during summers and during winters. And we would drive past these lush green paddy fields and sugarcane fields. And every now and then, especially once the sugarcane had been harvested, we could smell the sugarcane being cooked, right? That sort of gorgeous, lovely smell. So it's an area as well that I have incredible amounts of nostalgia over. And it's wonderful at some level to think about going back to doing this work, right? So this is Mandya, sugarcane growing region. It's also fed by irrigation from the damming of the Kaveri, the KRS dam, and you know, there's all kinds of water disputes between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, but we won't talk about that for now, right? Anyway. So the month following my conversations with Umesha about earthworms, this is in July, state-owned sugar factories began to shut down in Mandya, effectively closing the market for the farmers' cane. The number of farmers' suicides has subsequently risen. In Karnataka, over April, May, and June 2015, there were 39 farmer deaths, right? April, May, June 2015, 39 farmer deaths. By July 29th, 2015, 197 farmers had committed suicide in Mandya, most of them poisoning themselves with pesticides. Right? So you have dying earthworms, you have dying farmers. Meanwhile, transnational surrogacy in India took an interesting turn. Earlier this year, India banned commercial surrogacy altogether, but allows altruistic surrogacy as a reproductive arrangement between family members. And we can talk about the ban later on in the Q&A if you want. In this paper, what I'm doing is nurturing the germ of an idea for my next research project, and that is mapping the processes by which earthworms, sugarcane farmers, and surrogate mothers become objects of vampire capital. Technologies of life, seemingly apparent in sugarcane production and sugarcane and surrogacy, are in reality, I want to argue, technologies of death. We have come a full circle. Malthusian anxieties about exploding third world human populations and declining food production in the 1950s and 1960s led the US in its anxieties around the rise of poverty and communism to push for green revolution and simultaneously population control. The fields of Mandya and rural Bangalore and the peoples of these regions have been subject to these biotech innovations. Now, before I go any further, one of the things I wanted to point out in this slide was I was in Bangalore and also Mandya just for 3 weeks, so I didn't get any work done this summer. It was more of a vacation. All the canals that fed the sugarcane fields have run dry. The government is not releasing water anymore. So last year they stopped buying sugar. This year they stopped giving them any kinds of input for actually growing the sugar, right? So these regions this region which has been incredibly rich agriculturally is at some level facing a deep agrarian crisis. And so there's photographs, those are photographs I've pulled off the internet. Various photographers taking pictures of, you know, where they're using, what they use to kill themselves. This was a slide that I had about farmer suicides, but yeah. One of the things I wanted to point out was Mandya seems to have the highest rates of suicide, Mysore right next to it. Earlier at one point in time, I was really interested in doing research in Gulbarga. So that would be, let's see, where's Kalburgi, which is now Kalburgi, and where is Yadagiri, which used to be the Gulbarga district, which is now split into two. It's an incredibly dry region. The reason I was interested in this region is there's been a massive amount of out-migration from Yadagiri and Kalburgi, Gulbarga, into Bangalore. So now most of the construction workers in Bangalore are not Tamil, but they tend to be from Gulbarga. But what is interesting is, in spite of the agrarian crisis in Gulbarga, there haven't been as many farmer suicides. It's mainly been mostly out-migration. And Mandya and Mysore, which are incredibly rich agriculturally, with really good soil, lots of input in terms of water, have seen massive amounts of farmer suicides. These are the regions that have the highest rates of farmer suicides, right? Anyway. A little bit about the next slide that I have, right? Thinking about the kinds of population control policies. Mandya has been, actually, Mandya, Mysore, and Bangalore have had the earliest state-sponsored birth control clinics that were established in 1930. And so this region has seen all kinds of modernization interests implemented there. What is interesting, and I'm sort of reading as well as I'm in conversation with Chandan Gowda, who actually graduated from here in Michigan in sociology. He's now in Bangalore. And he talks about how some of these villages in Mandya actually had electricity before villages in Texas did, rural areas of Texas did, right? So LBJ brings electricity to Texas, but you know, it's, I guess, Vishveshwaraya who brings electricity to villages in Mandya. But what's interesting is for me to think about these kinds of parallel technologies of biotechnology, that we think about biotechnology really in terms of agriculture, and then you think about another phase of biotechnology, which is looking at reproductive technologies, right? What is called, I guess, stem cell technologies that Aditya Bharadwaj, anthropologist, calls the red revolution. Different kind of red because it deals with blood and bodies, right? So what I want to do is start linking these kinds of things together. And I would really like to think about how the green revolution and anxieties around population actually are coming together at the same time, and what's happening around Mandya, right? Anyway, so I don't need to go through this. But for those of you who are familiar with Paul Ehrlich and how he talks about the affect of being in Delhi and seeing people at the windows, you know, people everywhere, right? People eating, people washing, sleeping, people visiting, arguing, and screaming, thrusting their hands through the taxi window, begging, people defecating, urinating, people clinging to buses, people hurting animals, people. Since that night, I've known the fear of overpopulation. And then begins your population bomb, right? That's how the book begins. It's by the affect. And then he writes, which is, I think, a great dramatical opening to the book. Anyway, now what I want to do in the rest of this talk, having sort of told you where I want to go eventually with my research, is what I want to do is it's organized in the following manner. Through briefly rehearsing my just published book, Discounted Life and the Price of Global Surrogacy in India. Let's see if I have a slide. Yes, I do. Is it? Yeah. I discuss how surrogate mothers and intended parents, whom I call clients, negotiate the entry of pregnancy and babies into reproductive markets. How do labor markets, and the book really discusses, and I'm not necessarily going to rehearse that argument here, what I ask in that book is how do labor markets and surrogate mothers emerge? And one of the interesting things for me is many of the surrogate mothers in Bangalore are actually garment workers. They work in garment sweatshops. And so I sort of trace their movement into surrogacy, right? And the second set of questions that emerge is pregnancy a gift or wage labor? And if it is wage labor, does the baby become a commodity? Right? So what I do not address in the book, however, is how fertility doctors in India and brokerage firms for clients and surrogate mothers posit that women do not labor or gift. Instead, they rent out their wombs. Right? In other words, a gift or labor relationship embodied in a surrogacy pregnancy is converted into a property relationship between owner and renter. What does it mean to convert a commodity or perhaps even a gift into a rental relationship? How does this rubric disentangle in vivo wombs useful only within living women in order for them to be released into other sorts of entanglements? And what sorts of medical interventions are possible once that womb is leased as a space to grow a fetus that does not belong to the pregnant woman? While the growing literature on bioeconomies focuses on pharmaceutical industries, that is, Kaushik Sundarajan, clinical trials, Adriana Petrina, right? Commodification of organs, tissues, and cells, Nancy Shepper-Hughes, right? Walby and Mitchell. By working with surrogate mothers incorporated not as laborers, but their wombs coded as land, this presentation is an attempt at mapping the long histories of bioeconomies spanning land and living tissue in and around Bangalore. I argue that these are not bioeconomies but necroeconomies that produce death in industrial agriculture and post-Fordist reproductive labor. So let me now rehearse a little bit of my book argument here. So, the book at some level has a strange split personality. The second half of the book, which I'm really talking about, is thinking about how people are negotiating something that has never entered into the market as a market relationship, right? Here are surrogate mothers who've never delivered a baby for which they're going to be receiving wages, and they're going to cut it out of their lives completely. And here are client parents, intended parents, commissioning parents, whatever you want to call them, right, who are entering into the market so they can actually receive a baby from someone else who's given birth to that baby and are going to walk away with it. So what exactly is this exchange going on? What does this mean, right? So the book charts that. And what I say is, at some level, it's the age-old anthropology debate about whether this is a commodity or whether this is a gift, and people are trying to negotiate what this means. What I, at some level, note is that whether it's a gift or a commodity, these are simply objects that circulate in social spaces. But how they circulate is an important distinction. Gift exchanges signify ongoing social relationships between individuals or groups of individuals. And contrary to any romantic notion of egalitarianism, gift exchanges are marked by deep inequalities. Commodity exchange, on the other hand, is an atomized relationship where producers and consumers are strangers to each other. In exchange for money, consumers receive a commodity that has nothing to do with the person who's produced it, right? It's atomized, it's done once the exchange is done. And because of the structures of exchange under late capitalism, producers are almost always at a disadvantage. So as I've said, commodities and gifts reflect social relations, and the gift or commodity economy is bound up with the forms of the person who is diversely constituted and is in turn constituted herself by the gift or commodity exchange. Now, what I do in Discounted Life is that I argue that contesting whether the pregnancy and the resulting baby is a gift or commodity, the intended parents and surrogate mothers negotiate the terms of their relationship with each other. The intended parents are unequivocal, right? Though they use the language of gift in describing the transactions, and very often I've spoken with 20 intended parents, and I'm still friends with some of them, right? The constant thing that many of these individuals say is, the baby is more than life itself. It's such an amazing gift. No amount of money could really, at some level, explain the kinds of value this child has added into their lives, right? And the language is that of deep gifting that has gone on, what the surrogate mother has given to them, right? So what I say in the book is that though they use the language of gift in describing their transactions, they committed, however, to the practices of commodity production, meaning they don't want to keep in touch with the surrogate mother at all, right? They take that baby and leave, right? They have no interest in maintaining an ongoing relationship with these working-class Indian women who have labored to produce that baby for them. The surrogate mothers, on the other hand, are ambivalent. Many mothers spoke of the considerable labor they put into making those babies and why they should be paid a lot more than what they receive. Most of these surrogate mothers received $4,000, whether they'd given birth to twins or to a singleton baby. This was in 2011 when I did my research. And I spoke with 70 surrogate mothers, 70, surrogate mothers, right? They also talked about the kinfolk in their families who had labored to meet household responsibilities when the surrogate mothers had to live in dormitories. So very often, once the women got pregnant, they were expected to walk away from their homes and live in surrogacy dormitories, separate from their families. So then they needed to make arrangements to take care of their own children that they left behind. So they either paid neighbors or they paid in-laws, siblings, so on and so forth, to take care of their children. And very often they actually took loans in order to engage in surrogacy so they could pay off, and then, they would then repay the guy they took loans from anyway, right? The mother spoke too of the pain of separation from their own families, especially their young children. And they spoke at length about the discomforts and risks associated with pregnancy and childbirth. And finally, they describe the affective labor they performed in emotionally disengaging from the fetus so they could fulfill the terms of the contract and give up that baby once the child was born. However, even though the language that they spoke of was of production and labor and what they needed to do and to make this into a labor relationship and why they needed more wages, right? Many surrogate mothers, however, had an investment in a gift relationship because they wanted to negotiate ongoing social relationships with the babies they had given birth to, but also with their clients, right? And what I haven't written out here, but I do in the book, is think about what $4,000 means in Bangalore today. It's an incredibly expensive city. The money disappears in a matter of months, right? They've paid rent for houses, tuition for children. There are relatives who've fallen sick and they need to pay doctors, so on and so forth. The money really disappears in a matter of months. So for them, they already at some level, once they've become surrogate mothers and they've gotten this money, they're realizing how quickly it disappears. The ways by which you actually change your social class position, if that is ever possible, is through networks, right? It's about the ability to actually mobilize job opportunities, recommendation letters, small ongoing loans. Can someone buy books for your children as they go to school? Can you talk to the school principal to get the second kid into the school as well, right? So really for these women then, ongoing social relationships are far more important than simply a lump sum of cash. And so there's a deep investment then at some level in thinking about surrogacy at some level as a gift relationship, right? So I'm sort of, thinking through that in the book. Anyway. Okay, so in my book then, in Discounted Life, though, a third actor is in the whole exchange is missing, and this is something that's missing from the book. And this is the fertility doctors, the various brokers, and the brokerage firms that negotiate the exchange of money for babies between clients and workers. Here are the terms that you see in the media, but also clients and brokers tend to use, for surrogacy, right? Baby factory, India's back womb business, rent a womb industry, life factory, baby farm. Or in Kannada, the language that I speak, but also most of the surrogate mothers in Bangalore speak, they use the term badige tayi, right? Which literally means rental mother, a mother who is being rented, right? With this sort of language usage, a very curious shift happens. Something that has historically been exchanged as gifts within kinship networks, that is pregnancy, effort, and babies, does not get converted into labor when it enters into the market. Instead, surrogacy becomes a rental relationship. Though intended parents and surrogate mothers may contest the nature of the exchange, for various other agents involved, a surrogate mother is perceived as a woman who's renting her womb out, and through medical interventions, clients obtain occupancy rights to that uterus in order to grow their fetus. Then the surrogate mother is not even laboring to produce that baby. Instead, as reflected in, for example, Dr. Naina Patel's words, they're only donating their wombs for 9 months, right? Again, how does one donate a uterus, right? So it's sort of an interesting way. How do you sell? How do you rent? How do you donate your uterus? Right? She says, they're donating their uterus. And one of my interviewees, a person who used to take clients from the US to India until India banned surrogacy, she's actually a friend. She tells me that she believes that surrogate mothers are basically empty receptacles and they're doing nothing but carrying a baby for someone else, right? And she's someone who's had 3 children through a surrogate mother herself in Gujarat. Now, Catherine Walby and Robert Mitchell note in Tissue Economies that within the body, tissues constitute the biological substrate of the self, the condition of viable human life. Once donated, they can sustain the life and health of another. So they're thinking about donated eggs, kidneys, so on and so forth, right? In organ donation, stem cells, cord blood cells, and other sort of biomaterials that find their way into regenerative medicine, the tissue can and is extricated from donor to recipient. However, in the case of surrogacy, wombs are in workable productive condition only when entangled in women's bodies. That is, they operate in vivo. The problem then for the industry is to disentangle the womb from the woman to launch it into other kinds of entanglements, namely commercial surrogacy. The question to ask is this: what happens when objects in vivo, living organs, and in this case uteri, are cast as rentable property? In the first instance, the surrogate mother is perceived as putting no effort in making that baby, in what Walby and Cooper might call clinical labor. Instead, she's simply renting a space, albeit in her own body, that is at the moment not being invoked into usage by her kinfolk. Perceived as someone who puts no effort in making that pregnancy possible, she doesn't even have sex to get pregnant, right, to create life. The surrogate mother then becomes a subject of medical interventions. Her rented out uterus is the substrate, and its potentiality for growing fetal life is summoned through synthetic hormonal infusions into her body. Her uterine lining, assessed at regular intervals through transvaginal ultrasounds, is synthetically thickened so the embryos implanted in her will take root and grow. Because in vitro fertilizations have such low rates of success, they're very low. No one gives you proper statistics on this, right? Because everyone wants to amp the statistics on how good their practice is in producing viable pregnancies and full-term pregnancies. But the CDC says the success rates are about maybe around 20% of IVFs result in successful pregnancies. By successful pregnancies, I mean delivery of a child at the end of a pregnancy term. I shouldn't even say end of a pregnancy term because quite a few of them are preterm, right? Anyway. So because in vitro fertilizations have such low success rates, surrogate mothers in India had been routinely implanted with 4 embryos. And in order to up the odds of a positive, almost full-term pregnancy for the client couple, 2 women's wombs used to be rented for a single client or a couple. If all 4 embryos taken both women, right, if they take, then the surrogate mothers undergo highly uncomfortable fetal reductions. So you're basically injecting the fetuses with potassium chloride and reducing them one at a time over a period of time as they take bed rest. So, because if you remove all of them or you remove 2, then the hormonal fluctuations can be so strong that you abort all of them, right? So it's a very carefully done procedure. They call it fetal reduction. They don't call it abortions, which is the same thing, really. Anyway. And finally, almost all surrogate mothers undergo cesarean surgeries between week 36 to 38 of their pregnancies, right? Biological time is converted to technical time as babies are delivered just in time so clients can plan their schedules to come and pick up now their babies. And also doctors actually have an interest as well in doing cesareans because they can plan their schedules very effectively. But they can also figure out how many clients they can take in and plan out their business plans as to terms of, you know, I have this many beds opening up on such date, so therefore I can take X number of clients in, right? So they're able to make these calculations. So almost all of the surrogate mothers in India undergo cesarean surgeries between week 36 and week 38, just prior to going on to labor themselves. And by the way, many of them have had their own children. I mean, it's kind of odd to say own children, but I'm going to use that problematic term anyway. Many of them have delivered vaginally. And I'm not going to say it's natural childbirth because there may be other kinds of hormonal shots they've taken to, you know, epidurals and so on and so forth. But all of them have delivered, almost all of them have delivered vaginally, right? So it's not as if there's any medical indication for cesarean surgeries necessarily. Anyway, that's an aside. So the surrogate mother is rendered inert biological material, her womb now substrate for twin productions of middle-class family values and surplus value. The intended parents have achieved parenthood through intent. It is their desires for genetically descended children emerging from a combination of sperm and ova produced from their own bodies or germ cell banks that cast them as the true agents of the emergence of neonatal life, right? And this is why intended parents say it's my intent that made that baby. It is that which gets the whole system and process going, so it's my intentionality that matters the most, right? And this is why they call themselves intended parents. I kind of find that terminology problematic. Anyway, they legally own, wait, hold on. Okay, so the surrogate mothers, on the other hand, surplus value is created only through the exertions of high-tech and high-skilled labor. Those who add value to the process are urologists who extract sperm, reproductive endocrinologists who administer synthetic hormones to ripen ovaries and uterine linings, embryologists who prepare embryos either through in vitro fertilization or ICSI, infertility specialists who oversee the whole procedure, and gynecologists who surveil surrogate mothers and chart normal fetal development on growth curves, and finally deliver the baby through cesarean surgeries. Right? Okay, it's the next part. So for much of the 20th century in post-colonial India, something like a war has been waged against working-class women's bodies through population control programs. Their bodies have been perceived as sites for dangerous and overpowering fecundity that needed to be tamed first through intrauterine devices and eventually through permanent sterilization, especially after the emergency of 1975-77, right? Today, because of population control programs, sterilization is the most common form of chosen birth control among working class women in India. Many of the surrogate mothers I worked with in Bangalore had opted for sterilization as a form of birth control. So none of them can actually have their own babies anymore. They've all had 1 or 2 children, in some cases 3, so you don't need their eggs anymore. What happens very often is they sell their eggs because you can stimulate the ovaries, ripen the ovaries, and then through laparoscopic surgery pop out 35 to 40 eggs that can be sold to a client. And then further down the road, then she can be prepared to become a surrogate mother. There's no connection between the ovaries and the uterus because the connection is cut, right? And the embryos that now belong to the client that are prepared in a petri dish can be implanted into a uterus and then grown, right? So just because she's sterilized doesn't mean she can't get pregnant. I mean, I just kind of wanted to make that clear because people tend to get confused by that. It's actually not that confusing when you think about these processes. Anyway, so many of them have actually opted for sterilization as a form of birth control, right? Though her fallopian tubes are snipped, blocked, and tied, effectively blocking her eggs from ever reaching her uterus can still be prepared to receive embryos that legally belong to the clients who are eager to grow their families. Rendered medically infertile, her uterus is once more magically resurrected into fertility to grow those worthy children a priori, even before birth, belonging to upper middle class families. It is not just the state that perceives women as sites for intervention. Women already circulate as sisters, wives, mothers in a gift economy that mark kinship networks, and their sexuality and reproductive capacities are strictly regulated, right? So women are already circulating at some level within kinship networks. Daughters, giving away daughters in marriages, right, all of that. That's already going on. Surrogacy, however, radically unlodges the working class woman's body from patriarchal family control. Her body and reproductive labor are no longer harnessed as daughter, wife, and mother. Instead, surrogacy casts the woman as the sole proprietor of her own body. Now it is her right to use a uterus as she sees fit, which then allows her to rent her womb out. her body disentangled from patriarchal kinship networks, her womb is further disentangled from herself in order to enable other sorts of medical and market entanglements. Right, let me see if I have any other slides here. Sorry, this was some of the kinds of slides I had. I love this picture that was in the India Today. All the surrogate mothers have these pictures of these babies in front of their faces. It's incredibly disconcerting, but anyway, I just had to use that image. Anyway. Oh, this was a slide, a picture I'd taken of some of the surrogate mothers I used to hang out with. Sorry, I forgot to keep reading this. Okay. I want to use this image. Anyway, reaching the end of my talk, sorry. Now, various sociologists have described and theorized the spatial reconfiguration of the Fordist household, with sequestered, unpaid reproductive labor within nuclear and extended households outside of formal labor markets. But over the past few decades, with the rise of contingent work, near stagnant wages, and skyrocketing costs of living, middle-class women have exited their Fordist homes to enter into a post-Fordist economy as wage workers. Simultaneously, the task of reproductive labor has been progressively outsourced to a growing proletariat of service workers, most of whom are women of color. House cleaners, nannies, care providers for the elderly. These forms of emergent reproductive wage labor have been variously termed emotional labor, care work, intimate labor, right? But transnational surrogacy, I argue, is not a form of care, emotional, or intimate labor, because the processes in which the women are involved encompass far more than caring, emotional, intimate exchanges between mothers and fetuses and or clients. Cooper's and Walby's notion of clinical labor comes closest to capturing what is entailed in surrogacy. They define clinical labor as a conversion of concrete bodily material reality into abstract and temporal imperatives of accumulation at the level of the body. Life, they argue, generates surplus value. That is, biological processes are transformed into abstract, interchangeable units, complete with politically driven rates of exchange in the market. Clinical labor, they note very briefly and in passing, would not be possible without importing mass production methods prevalent in industrialization into agriculture and animal husbandry, and from there, as Adele Clark shows so beautifully, into interventions on infertile women's bodies that have remained stubborn for the purposes of reproducing families. Cooper and Walby say that, that each of these interventions deepen the incorporation of the biological into the market. That is, life is rendered newly pliable to the exigencies of abstract, exchangeable, or statistical time. Kalanthi Vora explores how surrogate mothers' uteri are seen as empty spaces, which I've done to do over here, and therefore can be hired out in order to generate monopoly rent, right? This rental relationship, she says, allows uteri to be legally isolated in producing that baby. Writing in a different register, Zeller describes intellectual property monopolies in the US in procedures such as gene sequencing of entire organisms, which effectively transform the processes of biological reproduction into valorized natural resources that generate rent-based revenues. It is through fieldwork in Bangalore that I came to understand how women's bodies are perversely valorized as natural resources that get incorporated into reproductive assembly lines. Once they've birthed their own children that nurture kinship networks and patriarchal family lines, their now fallow wombs can be harvested once again for middle-class families and markets. Their in vivo uteri are analogous to alienable land. It is from here that I tie what surrogate mothers undergo physically in order to generate family and surplus to the sugarcane fields of Mandya and the subsequent fate of earthworms and farmers. Tracing how land and women's bodies are incorporated into markets allows me to think through bioeconomies not solely as involving in vivo and in vitro human tissue and organs. Instead, it enables me to map the long histories of deepening market and corporatization of life itself in and around Bangalore. In my classroom and with friends, I half-jokingly say that I study vampire capitalism. To some extent, all forms of capitalistic enterprises can be seen as vampire-like. The more a worker exerts herself in sweatshop and transfers a bodily effort into alien products, the lesser she is left for herself. Thus, all kinds of production processes suck the lifeblood out of workers, yes, sure. Yet the processes unleashed through surrogacy and sugarcane fields of Mandya are far deeper, surplus accumulation occurring through gutting life itself. Standing witness to surrogacy in Bangalore and sugarcane fields in adjacent Mandya, it remains impossible for me to avoid looking at death. The term bioeconomies is suggestive of economies that thrive on life, but these, I cannot help but conclude, are necroeconomies that thrive on death. Thank you. Sorry, it was a bit choppy, but I'm still trying to work through this, and I was writing this today, but yes, yes. Oh, before I even field questions, this is a picture of in Gujarat, Anand. This is Dr. Naina Patel's new hospital that she's building, where she spent $12,000 of her own, $12 million, sorry, of her own money building a hospital. And I actually had the opportunity to visit it thanks to the person who talks about surrogate mothers as empty receptacles person. You know, she's actually a good friend. She takes clients to India, and this is when surrogacy was still open. I visited last September. It's a 5-story hospital that Naina Patel has planned and is in the process of building. The ground floor has, has room for 105 beds for surrogate mothers. The next floor is a space where she does her consulting work and sees patients, pulls in clients, so on and so forth. The third floor is where she actually does the lab work for doing the embryology, so on and so forth, and does the embryo transfer. The fourth floor is where the women go undergo cesarean surgeries, and you also have the nursery, and you have some dorms for intended parents who might want to stay there. And the fifth floor is a state-of-the-art lab facilities for research purposes. And what is the research purpose for? You know, she says there's quite a few embryos over whom no one has rights. There's quite a bit of fetal tissue because if each surrogate mother is going to have 4 implanted in her, there's fetal reduction. There's cord blood cells because surrogate mothers don't have the right to cord blood cells, and the surrogacy agreement doesn't give the intended parents the right to cord blood cells as well. So there's a lot of waste that is produced through surrogacy that is generated as raw material for research facilities. And the plan is to link up with boutique pharmaceutical companies that she will provide the facilities and raw materials for research. And this is going to be the next phase for her business. So I just wanted to end with that picture, but this was also at some level what's given me this idea for, you know, women's bodies as raw material. Anyway. Questions? Yes.
You know, when the IVF was
Oh, sorry. You're supposed to speak in a mic, I think,
Okay.
because it's getting recorded.
Okay, see, when IVF was, I don't know whether it's called discovered or invented, what it was. It was a great gift to infertile couples. But did anybody at that time think it's going to lead into this kind of surrogate thing?
You know, it's very interesting because the very first in vitro fertilized baby, Louise Brown, is 1978. Think about how quickly that comes about right after abortion is legalized in the US, or birth control is available for, you know, married women in the US, right? So these kinds of desisting, assisting pregnancies and such come together very closely. But very quickly from this being just sort of this maybe radical new idea, ethically disturbing process, it very quickly reaches the market. Today, as of 2012, there were over 5 million babies born through IVF. So there's nothing that remarkable at all. I mean, there were children in my child's daycare, a few of whom had been conceived through IVF. Some embryos frozen, so there was an older child and the second child, so one doesn't quite know what to call these children. Are they siblings? There's all these terms. It certainly wasn't thought that it would be this widely available, but I don't necessarily think the research was that innocent of market implications.
No, but my question is, did they really think that it's going to lead to surrogate market like this? Did they ever think that way?
Probably not, but it very quickly did. Within the decade, it certainly, I wouldn't say within the decade. Yes, 1987, yes, within the decade, it was happening. So I don't know whether Steptoe and or Edwards really thought it would, but they've certainly been at the forefront of also having their Cambridge Infertility Clinic as a commercial enterprise. Right, they also have a branch in Kerala, in Cochin.
Hi, so I had a question about, it was really interesting to think about the women navigating the differences between these gift economies and commodity economies, and especially how they're in between what you said, like kinship networks and these global markets. And I was wondering, one of the things that we know in economic sociology, or one of the arguments, is that people find meaning even in these sort of market economies. So like Viviana Zolitzer's argument that, even if they're exchanging money, it becomes earmarked in some way. And I was wondering generally about how women on both sides, I guess, of the arrangement, but especially the surrogates, how they thought about that exchange relationship, and especially if there was a way in which that money became earmarked or just...
I think at least with my readings, sociology doesn't quite know what to do with kinship and gifting. I think sociology is much more invested in commodity exchange. So this is why I found anthropologists far more fabulous on this question, right? Because the only way we can sort of at some level make sense of money in sociology is that, it has so many other meanings, which, only goes that far for me. But what was interesting in what I do in this book and the way I started off was we would imagine these kinds of processes to be deeply alienating, right? And I describe how it can be. But very often the surrogate mothers actually said this was very life-affirming. And it was interesting to think through what was going on. And I think for me what was interesting is to think about these women's labor histories and also reproductive interventions, right? Almost all of these women had already gone under the knife in terms of getting the tubes tied. So having medical interventions for reproductive processes was not necessarily new in that sense, even though they may not have had great prenatal care, right, for their own birthing their children. But also what was interesting is most of the recruiting in Bangalore happened in garment sweatshops. Bangalore's garment industry is really interesting, as also in certain parts of Tamil Nadu, as another Michigan person, I'm forgetting his name now, fraternal capital, Sharad Chandra, right, all these Michigan people I keep going back to, Sharad Chandra shows, right? But what is interesting in Bangalore is 80% of the garment workers are women, unlike other parts of India where it's about 60%, right? And the garment industry in Bangalore is very focused on producing for a global market, which is quite different from other parts of India. So they're really tied to global market production. And the women talk about how exhausting this work is. And one of the surrogate mothers whom I write about in the book, but also other articles, she says, I make you a shirt, you wear it for a few days and months, and you throw it away. I make you a baby, you keep it for life. And so she said, you tell me what has greater value and why I shouldn't think about making babies as so much more valuable for me as a worker even, right? So it's not just about what this money means, but what also this labor process is really about. And so they understand, as all of us do, that a garment and a baby are, gosh, two very different things, right? So they really contrasted working in this sweatshop and working in what I call reproductive sweatshops in interesting ways. Yes, I think you need to.
Just wondering, have the religious leaders in this country or in India taken any stand on the subject of surrogacy, like calling it immoral, or is it acceptable, or what?
It's interesting how religion has played out in all of this, because there's also this notion that, you know, I don't know, various Indian gods have emerged through surrogacy, right? Or it's actually really adoption, but you know, but there's also these notions, like Krishna, for example, right, who's given away at birth, so on and so forth, so he's not killed by his uncle, right? So there's all kinds of arguments that surrogacy doctors will make about how this is really a deeply religious Hindu, Indian, ancient practice, right? But also there's various politicians who start arguing, which is how surrogacy got banned, that this is antithetical to Indian womanhood, it's very degrading for women, you can't commercialize this, let's ban commercial surrogacy, but let's allow altruistic surrogacy. That's where the law stands. And so there's a whole bunch of us feminist scholars, including Sama in Delhi, and we're arguing that this actually deregulates the market so massively. So even the little bit of protection women might have had actually gets far worse. So now they're expected to produce babies for free, not even those measly $4,000 anymore, right? So it's actually very effectively deregulating the market and removing any kind of protection women might have had. And so ostensibly, altruistic surrogacy can just happen through family members who are arranging, but we know what happened with kidneys and what is happening with kidneys. Because kidneys can be exchanged only through relatives, right? So if I want to donate my kidney to my brother, for example. But all kinds of fictive kinship networks can work. So I would imagine a very similar kind of process is going to emerge with this as well. So strangely, those of us who are very critical of surrogacy are actually saying, please keep commercial surrogacy, because altruism is actually far worse than what is happening today.
Two very quick questions. I was struck that in many of the pictures you showed, there were pictures of men and presumably parents, father parents, on the part of the clients, but not many pictures of men among people you were spending time with during your field research. So I was just wondering what kinds of discourses around masculinity emerged through your field research. Just curious about that.
It's very interesting because, you know, there used to be a whole bunch of gay parents who would go to India for surrogacy purposes. And that gets gay parents are banned in 2012 from going to India. This is also another reason why I don't want to do surrogacy in India anymore, this kind of research, because I feel much more like an investigative reporter right now, just because of the way the industry is going crazy, right? Like, for example, when I was in Gujarat, September 2000, last year, I was there for just 10 days with Crystal. We also spent some time in Bombay. And there was a doctor in Bombay working with gay parents, even though he'd been forbidden from working with gay parents. But what he was doing was he was bringing surrogate mothers from Kenya through the networks that he had with his Gujarati family. And the Kenyan women were being kept for 24 weeks and then being sent back so gay fathers could pick up the babies. So it was a whole other kind of Indian Ocean trade, like the you know, that it just started feeling really dirty, and I didn't want to do this anymore. What is interesting is many of these dormitories, you don't see the husbands, because men are not allowed, the husbands are not allowed to come into these spaces. The anxiety is that this is why they keep the women in the dormitories, right? It's not just about nutrition, but they're not allowed to have sex. with their husbands, because who knows what working class men may carry, all the kinds of diseases they might, right? There's this deep-seated anxiety about working class people, right? Even though much as you need these women's bodies, there's also a whole, many of the surrogate mothers would talk certainly about, I didn't speak with their husbands, I spoke with a couple, but they would talk to me about how for the men it was very difficult to not think about that surrogated baby as theirs, because they've never been through pregnancy themselves, obviously, but when their wives are pregnant, it's generally had to do as theirs, right? So it became incredibly difficult, especially they would say, for their husbands to understand or at least emotionally sort of compute that this wasn't theirs. And so it was very hard for the husbands as well. And there's also this notion that these men are forcing these women to do this and so on and so forth. That's certainly not the case at all. Right? And in Bangalore, there's also no shame about being a surrogate mother. Because women would say, who's going to put food on my table? If they want to talk, let them talk. But let them also put food on my table, right? So there was actually no shame whatsoever. There used to be friends who would do this together, sisters-in-law who would do this together. And they wanted to do it together because then they could stay in the dorm together. Sort of a long answer to give.
One more.
Okay.
So I guess you've already started talking about this. I kind of have two questions. One is, what do you see as the sort of future of the surrogacy industry now that there are these sort of bans in place, and you've already sort of tracked some of that? The second is, I was wondering if you could describe a little bit. I'm trying to understand more what those 9 months are like, and if what
actually under 9 months, because
right, of course.
Yeah.
But also, is part of the incentive to have different you talked about the different kind of access that becomes available for surrogates, and I wonder if there's a kind of access to medical care that's also involved, or no?
Yeah, the dream is that they can convert this into a gift exchange. It never actually happens. But one of the nice things for the surrogate mothers is they're able to link up with other women who've engaged in similar kinds of labor processes, right? Anyway, the first was, what is the future of this industry now that it's banned? I guess Ritika and I were talking last night about Nepal, which now Nepal has banned surrogacy. But what happened when gay men were banned from going to India in 2012 is there were doctors in Delhi who had a whole bunch of frozen embryos. But also embryos were still coming in, right? So they were recruiting Indian surrogate mothers. Indian surrogate mothers, like the Kenyan mothers, were really cargo ships in a way, right? Getting them implanted with the embryos and sending them over to Nepal in Kathmandu to give birth to babies. And then the earthquake happens, right? And suddenly then the big news is that here is Israel coming in airlifting babies that were born through surrogacy. I think they were like about 24 or 25. Certainly the Australians are doing this as well. There's other clients who are doing this as well, but the big news was Israel doing this because Israeli news agencies made it a news item as well, right? But there were 24 babies that were airlifted, and then there was all kinds of panic. But what about the women who were left behind? And so there were 100 women who were airlifted to Israel to give birth to those babies in Israel, but I don't know what happened to those women. There really is no follow-up research or stories or anything about what's happened after that, right? Now, Nepal ostensibly is shut off as well. I'd heard of Apollo Hospital doing work in Bangladesh, but after the sort of ISIS attacks and so on and so forth there, that's closed off. And Crystal has been telling me, the person who's taken me to all these great places, she tells me that Russia is an emerging market. Mexico used to be, Mexico's closed off. Cambodia is emerging. It's Chinese capital to build hospitals. Indian and Thai doctors. Surrogate mothers from Cambodia and Thailand, and Indian egg donors. That's sort of the market setup, right? And also I hear Apollo Hospital is in conversation with Mauritius, and they're working with Mauritius to draw up surrogacy laws, right? I mean, this is why I don't want to do this anymore, because it's like, you know, all these little tidbits of information, and it's just becoming, it's just, I mean, when I finished the book in 2011 was when I finished the research, right? The book got published. It was such a moment of what felt like innocence in the industry, if you will, because things have just changed so massively, so rapidly since then. Did that explain some of your?
You know, even listening to you, it kind of emotionally upsets me. When you were doing the research, what were your personal emotions?
For me, I think it was, the hardest moment was
Did you
telling
cry at any time, not sleep at any time?
Yeah, I think for me the hardest moment was actually telling the surrogate mothers that they would be undergoing cesareans. They did not know, right? The first time I met them, and they were sort of shocked. And then I felt awful because they were in a panic, and I had to say, oh, don't worry, I had a cesarean too, and I'm fine. I'm like, but on the other hand, you know, it just felt so awful because I have great, incredible postnatal care. These women stay in the dormitory for about 3 or 4 days, and if they stay for any longer, they have to pay the dormitory a charge for staying. So they do not get postnatal care. So that was incredibly hard, right? I mean, everyone worries about, oh, these poor babies. I mean, at some level, yes. But the babies at some level do fine because they go into very loving homes, so on and so forth. It's really the women that is just an incredibly poignant story. The other part that was also very disturbing for me later on in my research was I was hearing of errors that were happening in labs. This was especially common in Delhi, more so than in other places, where, you know, when you're bringing a baby from India into the US, say, or Australia, or where have you, in order to give the baby a passport, the consulate is going to do cheek swabs to see if the baby is really genetically descended from you. Otherwise, how is anyone to know this isn't a case of trafficking or baby stealing, right? And here are people who are saying, this is my child, but you know, you didn't come in with a pregnancy. So when they do cheek swabs, the child is not genetically descended from either of the claimant parents, because mistakes happen in the lab, right? And so the child is basically then left with no legal parent and no country even.
So you just left at the customs office or what?
Literally, it disappears into the adoption system. It's become an orphan, right? There is no legal parent.
So the clients can't at that moment choose an adoption
The adoption system is run very differently because you can't kind of pick and choose and say, I want this baby, not that baby. So they could wait, but they can't make claims on, I want only this baby, right? So they're very willing, quite a few of them are very willing to say, oh my gosh, I've invested so much of my emotions into this. I can't let this baby go, but you can't take it, right? And apparently it had gotten so bad, and this is Crystal was telling me, and also the American consulate in Delhi, that they stopped doing cheek swabs on humanitarian grounds in Delhi because the rates of error was so high. I mean, this is why I can't do this research anymore, because it's just, I can't. I'd rather deal with dying earthworms, I guess. Yes, I think you need the, thank you, Janelle.
Hi, thank you. I was recently I heard about the Israel story in the news, and one of the things that I heard from, it was a set of gay parents, and one of the things they were really like debating about whether or not to seek out a surrogate service, and one of the things that sort of tipped the scales for them is that they were told that the amount of money the woman would get was about like $12,000 US, and that obviously doesn't end up happening because of the sort of middleman process, but just the idea that that amount of money is also kind of like a gift in a way
Yes,
of like
yeah.
getting someone out of poverty, of like changing lives. And I was wondering if any of the parents that you spoke to had like different notions about how much money actually made it to the surrogates, or what their like idea of if they had similar ideas.
Generally, they were told that they were paying $8,000 to $10,000. This is in 2008 to 2011, around that time period. But that amount of money never made it. Surrogacy is organized slightly differently in Delhi than it is in Bangalore, and also Gujarat, where they do these dormitories, or well, when it used to be legal, right? In Delhi, what they did was they had separate apartments where they kept surrogate mothers separately. So no surrogate mother knew, or at least set in one apartment, right, 2 or 3 set in one apartment, knew how much other surrogate mothers were making. So you really try to control the kinds of information sharing that was happening, right? So the surrogate mothers, on the other hand, get very little money. In Bangalore, it was, the doctor may charge, say, $8,000 surrogacy services, and they say, well, because we have her in the dorm, we feed her, we're taking her to this and this, that costs us about $4,000. So she's going to get $4,000, right? But they never quite given that breakdown. But yeah, I've actually heard of some women in other parts of India making like around $2,000. Right? So it never is that much money. If it increased, the prices increase for the surrogate.
Do you think people who seek out their services, if they had a more accurate knowledge of what actually does trickle down to the mothers, if that would affect their decision making about whether or not, or?
Based on what I know, I would say I don't think it would. Because I remember as I was finishing field work, some of the women that in that photograph had invited me over for lunch one day. This is, I'd finished field work, and they're like, no, come on, no. Because we all had cell phones in Bangalore. That's the only way you keep in touch, right? And so they sat me down and they said they were interested in starting a surrogacy co-op. And could I please bring them clients from the US? And I was like, my brokerage services are really not up to par. I can't do this. I'm not a very good broker. And they said, no, why don't you just speak with people? And I did speak with a few intended parents just to float an idea, saying, hey, there's people interested in starting a surrogacy co-op. And the plan would be that the women would stay at home. They could take each other to doctor's appointments, right? Give birth in ways that they would like to give birth, in whichever hospitals the clients chose. Actually, all of the client parents that I spoke with, and I didn't speak with all 20, I spoke with 4, some of them who were very social justice oriented as well, they all said they would never work with a surrogacy co-op. Because how could they know their babies would be safe with these women? So I think even paying more money, I don't think it would, they very often the kind of say, we've done a part, now what happens with that money? I have good intentions, but yeah. So that's the narrative. So I'd love to think they're much nicer about this, but doesn't work that way.
So Dorothy Roberts talks about eugenics reproduction and IVF as the new eugenics, talking about how people, rather than adopting babies of color, they are using people of color to produce white babies from white eggs. And I was wondering how you saw that kind of playing out.
What was interesting is with almost everyone, I just spoke with 20, so I can't say it's a huge sample, right? Almost all of them had bought eggs on the Indian market. Yeah, and so it was the husband's sperm, or if it was a gay couple, their sperm. But almost all of them purchased eggs in India. There was one woman who was very interested in using her cousin's eggs because she wanted red-haired babies or whatever, and so she was the only one who'd taken her cousin to Anand to get that woman's eggs out in order to be used for surrogacy. But many of them are actually using, and there's wonderful ways by which they're justifying this, right? Saying, after all, Indians are very smart people. It's okay if we don't do IQ tests. We look at all our software engineers. I mean, just these crazy stories. And then you feel like saying, you know, IQ and such has nothing to do with genetic makeup. I mean, yeah. But many of these were multiracial babies, not necessarily only white. Having said this, there are egg donors who are being recruited from the Republic of Georgia, but also sperm being sent to South Africa because there was enough of a white underclass where women were selling their eggs. And so you could prepare embryos there and then send it into India. But also I've seen ads where college students in the US have said, if you want a nice trip, you know, and meanwhile go drop a few eggs. I mean, not quite, but yeah. So make a trip to Bombay, and so yeah. But that is much less common.
Did you come across any clients who themselves were diasporic South Asians or Indians?
No, I didn't come across many of those. With me, for example, they were far more reluctant to talk with me. And it was also very interesting because writing this book kind of became a little bit difficult because quite a few of the intended parents were saying, oh, we're so glad you're writing this. But when when our children get older, then they'll know their histories of how they came about. And you're like, oh gosh, you know, the responsibility was too much. But also one of the surrogate mothers had told me, Ratnama had said, I'm so glad you're doing this because now my daughter will know how hard I've worked to raise her. So in both ends, there were these parents deeply invested in their children. And so at some level, that shapes how I write this book, you know, because I don't want a 15, 16-year-old. But also, if you do good sociology in a way, you don't vilify individuals. You think about larger processes, right? Yeah, it was a little bit, I can't do this anymore.
I have one question for you. And you have looked into in your research,
Mm.
mostly Bangalore and Delhi.
Yeah.
But as
Really Bangalore more because I know Kannada.
I see.
And
But in states, you know, India has multiple states and they have different laws.
Yeah.
Have you looked into any other states, how this surrogacy is prevailing?
Yeah, in Bangalore, it tends to be garment workers who are really recruited. In Gujarat, I'm not sure. It'll be interesting to think about, you know, say, for example, the Amul cooperative and, you know, how that plays out. I'm not sure what's gone on in Gujarat. There's no really good research in terms of where these women are coming from. There's good research otherwise. They're in Delhi because Sama, and also I have a graduate student, Rinda, who used to work with Sama, which is a health collective in Delhi. The understanding is many of them are coming from Punjab, and there's a massive agrarian crisis. There's quite a bit of drugs as well that is being sold there. And so because of the kind of agrarian crisis and the need for money, women are coming in as surrogate mothers. So I don't know what is going on there with the need for money, but again, thinking about Punjab and the Green Revolution, I would love for someone to actually work on that. I don't know Punjabi, my Hindi is pathetic. I'm not going to venture into Punjab. I'll just stick to Karnataka where, you know, I have a sensibility around space. That should be okay, I think, but, you know, I don't know language. And I'm going to miss a lot, I think. Thank you. Also, I kind of want to apologize to people there. I've been told there's some camera here, so I need to just stand like this. So,
I was just curious from what you said about the women's fear of having the cesarean and no medical coverage afterwards. Have there been specific consequences for some of the women because of the lack of medical care?
there was just one story that happened because of the 70 women I met, the outcome seemed to be fine, right? And then I also realized there was a self-selection process because I was meeting surrogate mothers through other surrogate mothers. So I wasn't meeting the negative cases, right, in that sense. But I did meet one woman who had actually had the embryo transfer, but had an ectopic pregnancy. So it was stuck in her tubes, right? And the monitoring hadn't been that great. She aborted and started bleeding, miscarried, and started bleeding very, very heavily. And so apparently the guy who owns the surrogacy agency paid for her medical bills, gave her some money just to, you know, tide her over these times. And then later on turned around and said, you actually owe me this much money, so you need to do surrogacy again in order to pay me back. Right? So I remember telling her, just discard your cell phone, just vanish. There's no way he's going to be able to know where you are. And she was like, yeah, I've thought of that already. Yeah, I mean, you know, what you're saying is not necessary. But, you know, I think it just sort of helped her to say, you should be doing that. But that was one case. It's interesting as well because what is the process when you get cuts, the skin starts growing over, what are those, the scarring that goes on? Keloids, yes. Apparently certain groups of Indian women are very, very prone to keloids. And what we know of keloids is when you cut tissue, keloids are not just external, but they can also grow internally. So we simply don't know about keloids that are affecting these women. There really are no medical studies.
No after studies of their health and so
Exactly, yes. Yeah, there's been none. We also don't know what exposure to repeated high dosage of hormones does.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering too.
Because they've donated their eggs a couple of times. They've become surrogate mothers. Obviously, it's not going to be successful the first time itself, so they've done it a couple of times. They may have been hyperovulated or hyperstimulated 4 times, 5 times at the very least. So there's simply no studies on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because as I was hearing you talk, what I could hear is a lot of concern about managing the embryo, very little concern about managing the woman.
Exactly, until that pregnancy is done, right? And the medical, medical treatment or, these kinds of interventions are actually far worse for pregnant women than beneficial. So people say, oh, but they're getting great nutrition and such good medical care. It's crappy medical care, actually, because it's all directed to the fetus rather than the woman herself. Right? So, it's really invasive and not at all great. Because very often people will say, oh, India has such high maternal death rates. Look at these fantastic facilities we have for them. Well, not for them. It's for the fetuses and the babies.
Anyone else? Thank you.
Thank you, Janelle.